evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday. Let's light up the darkness. New wisdom candle. Light. Who's in the house on a Thursday? Paula in Chicago, Carla in Brazil, Lucy in Minnesota, Sharon in New Jersey, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in the Great Northwest, Karen in Northern California, Guy in Ohio, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Chaim in Florida, Ella's in the house, Franco in Trieste, and Marjorie saying shalom, as well as Joseph in Massachusetts. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Schnur Gottlieb in memory of Rafael Tzvi ben Chaim Levi David and Michal Yaakov ben Chaim. May the neshamas have a great aliyah in the next world, in the world of souls. And we say amen and Schnur, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. Thank you so much for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Put that one over there. 1-4. Okay. Our daf is page 63, Samech Gimel, here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 1 here in chapter 7. So now we're talking about payments that are made, not so much as damages, because you injured somebody or ate his produce or trampled it or your fire got out and damaged his property, but rather because you stole, right? So when somebody steals, obviously they have to make restitution of what they stole, but depending on what kind of object was taken and whether the person voluntarily returned it and admitted that he took it, or if witnesses came and testified and that's how he was caught, there may be the penalty payment, the twofold payment that a thief pays. And if what he took was a sheep and then he slaughtered it or sold it, then he has to make a fourfold payment. And if it was an ox, a fivefold payment. And an ox, the value of an ox is very high. This could be onerous indeed, but hey, shouldn't have been an ox rustler, right? Okay, so we pick this up right near the bottom of page 62b. And the Gemara asks, if the law, the halacha of a double payment, is limited to cases that are similar to the details mentioned in the verse, it should also be derived that just as each of the items mentioned in the detail is clearly defined as an item whose carcass transmits impurity through contact and carrying, so too any item whose carcass transmits impurity through contact and carrying, it is subject to the double payment. But birds whose carcasses do not transmit impurity, right, tuma, ritual impurity, through contact or carrying, should not be subject to the double payment. So the Gemara objects to the question, but how can you say this? But isn't garment written in the list of specified items in Exodus 22:8? So it is impossible to speak of the impurity of carcasses with regard to clothing. And the Gemara responds, saying in response to this objection, we are speaking specifically of animals. And this is the question that was asked. Why not say that with regard to animals, an animal whose carcass transmits impurity through contact and carrying, yes, it is subject to the double payment, whereas an animal whose carcass does not transmit impurity through contact and carrying, such as a bird, no, a thief would not pay the double payment for stealing it, right? That's not the law. You do pay the double payment. The question is why. So now we're on 63a, and this line of reasoning is correct because we expound each one of the listed items in the generalization and detail and generalization by itself. Each item is treated individually as representing a category, but the different items are not grouped together into one broad category. Since several animals are listed, it is concluded that if the stolen item is an animal, it must resemble the listed animals. But since birds do not transmit impurity through contact or carrying, they are not subject to the double payment. And the Gemara rejects this. If so, let the merciful one write just one detail, i.e. animal. And that would have been enough to teach that animals are subject to double payment only if they transmit impurity through contact and carrying. So birds are excluded. Since the Torah listed several animals, birds are included. Now the Gemara questions this assertion. Which individual animal should the merciful one have written? If the merciful one had written only ox, I would say that only an animal that is similar to an ox, in that it is sacrificed on the altar. Yes, it would be subject to the double payment. But an animal that is not sacrificed on the altar, no, it would not be subject to that payment. And if the merciful one had written only donkey, I would say that only an animal that is similar to a donkey, in that its firstborn male offspring is sacred with the sanctity of the firstborn, yes, it is subject to a double payment. But an animal that is not sacred would not be subject to a double payment. So the principle, not sacred with respect to the firstborn, would therefore not be subject to the double payment. So the principle of double payment would then include cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys, but not other animals. So the Gemara responds, say in answer to this question, if so, if the Torah had wished to limit double payment to cases where cattle, sheep, goats, or donkeys were stolen, well then the merciful one could have just written ox and donkey. Why do I need the verse to mention sheep? Conclude from it that the Torah intends to include even animals that do not meet these criteria. For example, birds. So the Gemara asks further, but say that the verse mentions sheep in order to only include kosher birds, which are similar to the sheep listed in the verse, in that the carcass of these birds renders both the one who eats it and his garments ritually impure when it passes through his esophagus, as the carcass of a sheep also transmits ritual impurity. But non-kosher birds, whose carcasses do not have ritual impurity at all, as they do not render either the one who eats them or his garments impure when they pass through his esophagus, no, they are not subject to double payment. You're not permitted to eat a non-kosher bird, but what we're talking about is whether it can transmit tuma to you or not through that process. So the Gemara answers the word any, kol, sometimes translated as all, but here translated as any, in the phrase for any matter of trespass, right? Kol, for any matter of trespass. This is an amplification. And it serves to include even non-kosher birds in the principle of the double payment. So the Gemara asks, but is it so that anywhere that the Torah wrote the word kol, it is an amplification? But isn't it so that with regard to second tithe, the word kol is written in the verse, and you shall bestow the money for whatever, bechol, your soul desires, for oxen or for sheep, for wine or for strong drink, or for whatever your soul asks of you. That's Deuteronomy 14:26. And yet we expound that verse as a generalization and a detail and a generalization. Now, this has come up, it's come up several times now recently that this is an exegetical principle. One of these methods is derived from Rabbi Akiva, the other one from Rabbi Yishmael. And we contrast things that sound kind of similar, but they're not. Right, so there is generalization and detail, or sometimes generalization followed by a detail followed by another generalization. And there is amplification and restriction, and sometimes amplification, restriction, and amplification. So how does generalization and detail differ from amplification and restriction, right? Because these are methods that the sages use to derive additional laws from the written Torah. Beyond what's explicitly written there. So here's a nice description. It's still a little bit complicated, but it's nice to hear this, and let's see if we can hold on to it. So I'm going to read it slowly. So the methods of amplification and restriction and the method of generalization and detail are two exegetical approaches to biblical verses. They are attributed to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael respectively, right? So Akiva is amplification and restriction. So AA, amplification and restriction, is Akiva. And generalization and detail is Rabbi Yishmael. Nevertheless, all of the sages used both of these methods, except in certain circumstances in which each would insist on using his own specific approach. Now, both methods are applied to biblical verses in which there is a general statement followed by specific examples of the same law. Now, depending on the presentation, there may be an amplification followed by a restricting term corresponding to a generalization and a detail. I'm going to read that again. Depending on the presentation, there may be an amplification followed by a restricting term corresponding to a generalization and a detail, a restricting term and an amplification corresponding to a detail and a generalization, or an amplification and the restricting term and amplification corresponding to a generalization and detail and generalization. So according to the principle, so that's how it can occur in the text. But here's the difference between the two methods. So I'm here alone. And of course, what I didn't bring with me was tissues so I could blow my nose. I have this one old one. Hopefully that'll get me through. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. Let's try to keep this going. So, according to the principle of generalization and detail, right? So that's Rabbi Yishmael's principle. Generalization and detail. So the example mentioned in the biblical verse provides detail through an explanation and definition of the general rule. Consequently, the detail always limits the scope of the generalization, whereas the generalization that follows the detail is almost always an expansion of the specific example that was cited. By contrast, the method of amplification and restriction, Rabbi Akiva's method, there, the specific case mentioned in the biblical verse is not meant as an example of the general law, but rather as a defining feature that limits the case by indicating what is not included in the amplification. So when an amplification is followed by a restricting term, and these two expressions are followed by another amplification, the only items excluded from the amplification are those that totally differ from the restricting term. Therefore, this method of exegesis tends to be more inclusive than the principle of generalization and detail, and followed by generalization, in which the final generalization expands the detail to include items similar to it. So are we adding items that are similar, or are we, limiting what the law is going to expand to? Okay, so that's the general idea. So where am I? Okay, so we were talking about how the law was listed with respect to the second tithe when a person would go up to Jerusalem for a festival when the temple was standing. And the law in Deuteronomy 14:26 said, "And you shall bestow the money for whatever your soul desires, for oxen or for sheep, for wine or for strong drink, or for whatever your soul asks of you." So you can see definitely that's general, detail, general, or amplification, restriction, amplification. Because certainly, once the verse said, "And you shall bestow the money for whatever your soul desires." Okay, so you have to save the money. And the only limitation on what you do with that second tithe money is that you have to spend it in Jerusalem when you go up there for the festival. That's what we would have gotten out of you shall bestow the money for whatever your soul desires. But then the Torah adds examples for oxen or for sheep or for wine or for strong drink or for whatever your soul asks for you. So what did we learn? Did we say, oh, okay, so I have to spend it in Jerusalem, but, I can't spend it in a bar, on bar games and entertainment, right? It seems like, okay, I have to spend it on meat and drink. But then it adds again, or whatever your soul desires. So then I've expanded again. So what is it? That means that any kind of meat and any kind of drink, or any kind of food, but not other things that are not food, right? So that's the kind of question that we're asking in order to derive what exactly was the Torah telling us in that example. So as it is taught in the Baraisa, and you shall bestow the money for whatever your soul desires. This is a generalization, as no particular type of food is specified. Then the Torah says, for oxen or for sheep or for wine or for strong drink. This is a detail. As specific types of food are mentioned. And then when the verse concludes with, or whatever your soul asks of you, it has generalized again. Since the verse is formulated as a generalization, detail, generalization, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail. And this indicates that just as each of the items mentioned in the detail is clearly defined as the produce of produce, i.e., they grow from a parent organism, for example, agricultural produce or livestock, and they are grown from the ground, i.e., their sustenance comes from the ground, right? Sheep and cattle and oxen eat, right, herbage from the ground, as opposed to an animal that eats other animals. That would not be included. And they are grown from the ground, i.e., their sustenance comes from the ground. So too, the category of items that one may purchase with second tithe money when he goes up to Jerusalem for the festival includes all items that are the produce of produce and are grown from the ground. So the Gemara responds, say in answer to this question that the term, and now why do we bring down that law? Because this word bechol, any, right, as in, and you shall bestow money for whatever your soul desires, for anything that your soul desires, is now attached to the concept of a generalization. So the Gemara responds, saying in answer to this question, the term bechol is a generalization, whereas the term kol, same word but with a little prefix added to it, in bechol, right, in any, or with any, and then whereas the term kol, just any, is an amplification. And if you wish, say a different answer. The word kol is usually a generalization, but the word kol that is written here in the verse concerning the double payment, which is what we've been talking about in our tractate, is an exception. It is regarded as an amplification, as the Gemara will explain. So after all, there is another generalization, detail generalization, written at the beginning of this passage, as it is written, if a man gives his neighbor money or vessels to safeguard, and it was stolen from the house of the man, if the thief shall be found, he shall pay double. So if a man gives his neighbor, this is a generalization. What is he giving him? Money or vessels. That's the detail. And when the verse concludes to safeguard, it has generalized again. And if it enters your mind to say that this later verse, for any matter of trespass, is also coming to state a generalization and a detail and a generalization, then let the merciful one write these details, i.e., ox, donkey, sheep, and garment, which are cited in the later verse, together with that previous generalization, detail, generalization. So why do I need the latter verse beginning with, for any matter of trespass? Conclude from it that the word kol is an amplification in this instance. And what does it amplify? It includes all animals. So the Gemara asks, now, right, we were deriving that if somebody steals a bird and then, he doesn't admit it, but he's caught and he has to make restitution, he's going to have to make the double payment for a bird just as he would with any other animal. Now the Gemara asks, now that you said that the word kol is an amplification, why do I need all these details that are listed in the verse? Ox, donkey, sheep, and garment. And the Gemara answers, as for the three animals that are listed, one is mentioned to exclude land, One is mentioned to exclude Canaanite slaves, and one is mentioned to exclude financial documents. And the example of a garment is mentioned to exclude an item that is not clearly delineated in size or quantity. Or for any manner of lost thing, this is written to teach that which Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says. As Rabbi Chiya bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, with regard to one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole a lost item that he had found, which he had been obligated to safeguard until it could be returned to the owner, like somebody who is found a lost item and is holding it until it's time to return it to the owner. So he, planned to do the mitzvah, to fulfill the commandment of returning a lost item, but then he kind of fell in love with the item and he didn't want to give it back. So instead of giving it back, he claims that while he was holding on to it in order to give it back, it was stolen from him. And he lies. It's a lie, right? So then what happens when he's caught claiming that the object he was going to return to its owner who lost it, when this guy who found it claims that it was stolen from him and he lies, then is he going to be treated like a thief who actually stole it or not? And we've seen this question before. So with regard to one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole a lost item that he had been holding, in which he was obligated to safeguard until it could be returned to the owner, when he makes this lie and gets caught, he pays double payment, as it is stated, for any manner of lost thing about which one shall say, this is it, the one whom the judges convict shall pay double to his neighbor, at Exodus 22:8. Now we're on page 63b. So we learned in a Mishna elsewhere on page 108b about a case where an owner of an item said to the Bailey, right? So the Bailey is somebody who's taking care of your object. And there's the two cases, either the paid Bailey or the unpaid Bailey. And as you can imagine, somebody that you pay to watch your property has a higher degree of responsibility and liability if it's lost or stolen than one who is watching it as an unpaid Bailey. He's just doing you a favor, right? So we learned in the Mishna on page 108b about a case where an owner of an item said to the Bailey, where is my deposit, right? That which I deposited with you to watch it for me. And the Bailey said to him, it was lost. So the owner can say, I administer an oath to you that it was actually lost. In other words, swear to me that you're not just keeping it for yourself or you were negligent in some way. Swear to me that it was lost. So the owner said, so the Bailey says, Amen. In other words, he takes the oath. And subsequently, the witnesses testify about the Bailey that it wasn't that he lost it, it's that he himself consumed it. Like he was asked to watch an animal and he slaughtered and ate it. It wasn't lost. He ate it. So in this case, the Bailey pays the principal, i.e. the value of the deposit to the owner. Now, if the Bailey admitted on his own that he stole the deposit before any witnesses testified to this effect, he pays the principal and an additional 1/5 of the principal amount to the owner, and he brings a guilt offering to atone for his sin. Presumably, if he was caught, right, he has to make an atonement, but the guilt offering doesn't work, and presumably he has to make the double payment, not just adding a fifth. Now, the Mishnah continues with a different case. The owner said to the Bailey, where is my deposit? And the Bailey said to him, it was stolen. So the owner said, I administer an oath to you. Swear to me that it was stolen. And the Bailey said, Amen. He accepts the oath upon himself. And then witnesses testify about the Bailey that he himself stole the deposit. So in this case, the Bailey pays double payment. If he admitted his theft on his own, he pays the principal and an additional 1/5 to the owner, and he brings a guilt offering to atone for his sin. So the Gemara says, in any event, the Mishnah teaches that in the case of a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit, he pays double payment. But in the case of a Bailey who falsely claims that a deposit was lost, he does not pay the double payment. Oh, I'm sorry, I was confused. In that first one, of course, there's no double payment, even though he lied, because what he was claiming is that it was lost when in fact he consumed it. Now that is theft, but they're saying that's not going to trigger the double payment. All right, so a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole it, he pays a double payment. But in the case of a Bailey who falsely claims that a deposit was lost, he does not pay the double payment. And it also teaches that even with regard to one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit, it is only by taking an oath to substantiate his claim that he pays double payment. But for simply lying without taking an oath, he does not pay the double payment. Right? Is that the law? We're not sure yet. That's what we've learned so far. So from where are these matters derived? As the sages taught in a Baraisa, the Torah states, if a man gives his neighbor money or vessels to safeguard, and it was stolen from the house of the Bailey, if the thief shall be found, he shall pay double. And the verse is speaking of a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole it from him. So the Baraisa continues, do you say that the verse is speaking about one who falsely claims that a deposit was stolen? Or perhaps it is speaking only about the thief himself, teaching that if the actual thief is caught, he pays the double payment. So when the Torah says in the following verse, if the thief shall not be found, the one whom the judges convict shall pay double to his neighbor. And the verse is speaking of who? Of one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit, as it states that no other thief was found. Since the latter verse is speaking of one who falsely claims that a deposit was stolen, it stands to reason that the earlier verse is speaking of this case as well. And it is taught in a different Baraisa when the Torah states, if the thief shall be found, he shall pay double, at Exodus 22:6. The verse is speaking of the thief himself. Do you say that it is speaking about the thief himself? Or perhaps it is speaking only about one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole it from him? If so, then when the verse then says, if the thief shall not be found, the one whom the judges convict shall pay double to his neighbor, the case of one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit is already stated. How then do I realize the first verse about paying double, if the thief shall be found, so that it is not superfluous? It must be that the first verse is speaking about the thief himself, and the second verse is about one who claimed that he was robbed by a thief and the claim was a lie. So the Gemara comments, although the two Baraisas disagree about the meaning of the earlier verse, in any event, everyone agrees that the latter verse, which states, if the thief shall not be found, imlo yimatse haganaf, shall pay double to his neighbor. And this is referring to a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit from him. So from where is this interpretation inferred from the verse? The verse doesn't say anything about the Bailey claimed that a thief stole it from him. Why are we reading that into it? And Rava said that the verse should be understood as follows. If it is not found, imlo yimatze, to be as he said. If it is not found to be as he said, not if the thief is not found or if the object is not found, but rather if it is found that he lied. So imlo yimatze, if it is not found to be as he said, i.e. if his claim that the deposit was stolen is found to be untrue, but rather he himself stole it, then he shall pay double to his neighbor. And the Gemara turns its attention to another facet of this law. And from where do we derive that this double payment of one who falsely claims that the deposit was stolen from him applies only when the Bailey has taken an oath that it was stolen? Why is an oath one of the elements of whether we are going to charge him with the double payment? Isn't it enough that he lied? Why is it only going to trigger the double payment if he also takes an oath? And the Gemara answers, as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse, if the thief shall not be found, the homeowner shall approach the judges to determine if he laid his hand, shalach yado, on his neighbor's goods. And this means that he shall come to the court for the purpose of taking an oath. And do you say that he comes to court for the purpose of taking an oath? Or is it perhaps only for the purpose of facing judgment? And the meaning may be determined by means of a verbal analogy. Laying the hand, shilchut yad, is referring to misappropriation. And that is stated later in the verse, the oath of the Lord shall be between them both to see whether he has not laid his hand, shalach yado, on his neighbor's goods, Exodus 22:10. And laying the hand is stated above at Exodus 22:7. Just as laying the hand later is referring explicitly to an oath, so too laying the hand here is referring to an oath. So the Gemara analyzes the two baraisas cited earlier. Granted, according to the one who says in the second baraisa that one verse about double payment is speaking about the thief, and one verse is speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit from him. This is why two verses are written, as each verse teaches a different law. But according to the one who says in the first baraisa that both of the verses are speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole from him, why do I need two verses? One verse should be sufficient. And the sages say, even according to the one who says that both of these verses are referring to a Bailey who swears a false oath, both verses are still necessary because one verse serves to exclude from double payment the case of one who falsely states the claim that the item has been lost as opposed to stolen. Double payment is paid only when the Bailey falsely claims that the item under his care was stolen. And the Gemara asks, and according to the one who says that one verse is speaking about a thief himself and the other verse is speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole it from him, so that there is no so that there is no superfluous verse, from where does he learn, the one who says that this one verse is referring to the thief and the other verse is referring to the Bailey who falsely states, from where does that one learn to exclude from double payment a Bailey who falsely claims that the item was lost rather than stolen? And the Gemara answers, the one who interprets this way derives that particular law from the fact that the verse could have stated, if a thief, a ganef, shall not be found, but states instead, if the thief, haganef, shall not be found. Right? The was not necessary, and since it is used, a thief versus the thief, so the specification of the actually allows him to learn out that same idea. And the Gemara asks, and since according to the one who says that both verses are speaking about a Bailey who falsely claims that the thief stole the deposit, and one of the verses excludes the case of a Bailey who falsely claims that the deposit was lost, so what does he derive from the fact that the verse did not state if a thief, but rather if the thief? And the Gemara answers, he could have said to you that this terminology is necessary to teach that which Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says. As Rabbi Chia bar Abba says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, one who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit pays double payment. And if the deposit was an ox or a sheep that he slaughtered or sold, now we kick into the high gear of the fourfold or fivefold payment. Right? That's only for sheep or oxen, not for other kinds of animals or other kinds of property. So the Gemara notes, according to the one who says that one verse is speaking about a thief, and one verse is speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that the thief stole the deposit, who employed this change in terminology, i.e. the fact that the verse could have stated, if a thief shall not be found, but rather it states, if the thief shall not be found, to exclude the case of a Bailey who falsely states the claim that the deposit was lost, there seems to be no source to teach the law stated by Rabbi Chia bar Abba. So accordingly, from where does he derive the law taught by Rabbi Chia bar Abba? And then, right, so we're tracing two different manners of deriving these laws and asking, well, since they both basically agree on the law, but they're disagreeing on how to derive it, how is each one of them, who interprets a little bit differently, going to derive all the same laws? Right? So he could have said to you, it is a juxtaposition, as liability for double payment for a thief and for a Bailey who falsely claims that the deposit was stolen. These two laws are juxtaposed to each other. Therefore, just as a thief pays a fourfold or fivefold payment if he slaughtered or sold the animal, so must the Bailey. And although these two cases are not entirely comparable, this derivation cannot be refuted on that basis, as there is a principle that one cannot refute a derivation based on a juxtaposition by drawing distinctions between the two juxtaposed cases. And the Gemara asks further, granted, according to the one who says, the one verse is speaking about the thief, and the other verse is speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit, it is well. But according to the one who says that both verses are speaking about a Bailey who falsely states the claim that a thief stole for the deposit, from where does he derive that a thief himself must pay the double payment for stealing? Now, that's the good question. It makes much more sense to say, okay, it talks about stealing. It says it twice. So once we're talking about the thief himself, and the other time we're talking about a Bailey who falsely testifies that a thief stole it from him, and then he gets caught. But the other view is, no, actually both of those verses are talking about a Bailey who falsely states that it was stolen from him when it wasn't, and the wording is a little different, and we need to learn two different ideas about that same guy. But according to that view, how do we know that the thief himself who steals something and he gets caught has to make a double restitution? If you're not going to learn it from one of these two verses, where are you going to learn that from? And if you would say, let it be derived by a kal v'chomer inference from the case of the Bailey, who falsely states the claim that a thief stole the deposit, the kal v'chomer being that if one is obligated to pay double payment for falsely claiming that a deposit was stolen, which constitutes passive theft, all the more so must a thief himself pay the double payment, because that's active theft. But this derivation is not possible. And the reason is that it is sufficient for the conclusion that emerges from a kal v'chomer inference to be like its source. In other words, a law derived by means of a kal v'chomer inference cannot be more stringent than the law of the source from which it is derived. And consequently, on the basis of this kal v'chomer inference, it would have to be concluded that just as there in the source case, the double payment is required only when the guilty party took an oath. And so too here, when the thief himself pays double, it is only when he took an oath that he did not steal it. But we don't have that requirement. So the Gemara responds, he derives the obligation of a thief to pay double payment without having taken an oath from a third verse that we haven't talked about yet. If the theft shall be found in his possession alive, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. Exodus 22:3. So the double payment in this verse applies to all items, as it is derived from that which the school of Chizkiah taught. As the school of Chizkiah taught, let the verse state only ox and theft, and all items would be included. Why is it necessary to also mention donkey and sheep? Had the verse been written this way, I would have said, just as the item mentioned in the detail is clearly defined as an item that is sacrificed on the altar, so too, everything that is sacrificed on the altar is subject to double payment, but other items are not. What else is there for you to include in this category? Sheep, which like oxen can be sacrificed on the altar. When the verse states sheep, a sheep is thereby stated explicitly. Therefore, the detail of ox cannot be written to include specifically items that can be sacrificed on the altar, for example, sheep. How then do I realize the meaning of the word theft, i.e., what is the category of items derived from the detail and generalization? It must be that it serves to include all types of items in the requirement of double payment. And that's where we're going to knock off. Till tomorrow at the regular time of noon Pacific, because it's Friday. Okay, and let me, Nina is coming home tonight, God willing, so this should be the last time where I'm scanning the comments myself. Looks like you guys are having a big conversation about stuff. But are these actually questions? So Joseph says, I met a Jewish man in line today, and he noticed my IDF jacket and told me his Hungarian family were conversos that became Christians, and he supports Israel. Hungarian Jewry is Litvak, right? No. Right? So when we're talking about, I mean, not necessarily. So when we're talking about Litvak, I mean, that's my name, but a Litvak is generally used as a description of a type of Ashkenazi Jew, right? So Ashkenazi Jews are Northern European as opposed to Sephardic Jews, which are generally Southern Europe and sort of Mediterranean rim. So Ashkenazi Jews, right? Northern Europe. And the general sort of, there's many divisions and categories, but one big one is Litvish versus Hasidish, right? And Hasidish or Hasidic, that's actually quite a recent phenomena in Jewish history. Like the Baal Shem Tov, who created Hasidic Judaism, lived in the 1700s. So it's only between about 300 years old, let's say, even less. When it really got going, it was more about 200 years ago. So 250 years, even 300 years, that's nothing in Jewish history, which is at least 3,000 years old. But when this new movement of Hasidic Judaism came, it was very unpopular, kind of among the more scholarly Jews who are called Litvish or Litvox. Not so much because they are really what it means is Lithuanian Jew. A Litvak is a Lithuanian Jew. But when we say Litvish, we're more saying Jews in the tradition of Talmudic scholars and sort of the apex of where the Talmudic academies were in Northern Europe in this period, let's say during the last 500 years, was in Vilna, in Lithuania, as epitomized by the Vilna Gaon. Right? So if you're talking about Hungarian Jews, so they could be Hasidic, and they were, like Satmar, right, which is a big Hasidic group based mostly in Williamsburg these days, but also in Kiryas Yoel, right, like, a little bit northern in, where's that, like Orangeburg, right, a big community in Orangeburg in the Hudson Valley. Satmar is so funny because that's a Hasidic movement called Satmar, because their founder, Rabbi Teitelbaum, right, came from Satmar, Hungary. Satmar in Hungary, if you translate that to English, is Saint Mary. It's hilarious that there's a very, very strict Hasidic group and large. And they're called Satmar. It's like Saint Mary, but it's because these Hasidic groups tend to be called after the place where the dynasty originated. So Chabad is also known as Lubavitch because the Alter Rebbe was in Lubavitch. Then there's Bells and whatever, Stoliner, many Hasidic movements. But that big division between Hasidic and Litvak or Litvish. It's just kind of they're both Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox sometimes, but, it's just a little bit of a different approach in how they learn. They obey all the same laws, but they just have some different customs. Very wordy answer to you. I'm sorry, Yosef. But the Hungarians in general were a slightly different community in a lot of ways. There are many Hungarian Jews. I mean, and we're not talking about Hungarian Jews now, which tend to be Israelis, but, the Hungarian Jewish community was, suffered terribly in the Holocaust, and so many of them left, like my family, right? But what was interesting about the Hungarian Jews is that although many of them did speak Yiddish, a lot of them didn't, and they kind of had their own thing going. And so the Hungarian Jews are just a little bit different. Definitely there's Hasidic Jews and there's Litvish Jews in that Hungarian Jewish community, but the Hungarians have their own sort of particularities. Okay. Bill, animals that don't eat other animals. But hold on, why do we need to say that? No predatory animal is kosher. I was thinking that as I was saying it earlier. To eat, and it may be taken by default that one cannot use the money to buy non-kosher food, surely. Yes, absolutely. So I think when they were saying that it gets its sustenance from the ground, it was just another sort of commonality. But I think your point is, but why does that even need to be said, right? If we're talking about a kosher animal, is there any kosher animal, that doesn't have a plant-based diet? And I don't think there is, right? Because when we're talking about kosher birds, no way. Birds of prey are not kosher for eating. Cattle, sheep. There are undomesticated kosher animals. Like a deer is a kosher animal, but you would have to catch it and then slaughter it in a kosher manner in order to be able to eat it. But they're also, plant eaters. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know why that, how are they making that? I guess what's interesting about that is that they're trying to lump it together with plants, right? That you could spend it on vegetable matter or animals. And they're saying that both draw their sustenance from the ground, right? Which is interesting, right? So the plants obviously draw their sustenance from the ground, and then animals that eat plants that grow from the ground are in that same category for that when they're making that sort of generalization and detail and generalization about where you can spend your Meiser Sheni, your second tithe money. You guys are talking about Galicianers and Ukraine, and you know what? I bet you that Sharon is more knowledgeable about that than I am. So I'm going to let her handle that conversation. And so that's it for me today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at noon Pacific. And Nina will be here to moderate the questions and pass them over to me, God willing. Have a great night. I look forward to learning page 64.